This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Every few months, there's a news report about a company that goes bankrupt, and as a result, the retired workers won't get their full pension. This is obviously a big problem because you work your entire life expecting you'll be getting a pension when you retire. So if you're now retired, it's kind of late to go back to work and replace all of that lost income. So every time this happens, someone pops up on TV and says that the solution is to protect pensions in the event of a corporate bankruptcy. That makes sense, but what does that mean and how would it work? So on today's episode of Debt Free in 30, we're going to cover two topics. First, should pensions be protected when a company goes bankrupt? And second, how can you protect yourself if your employer goes bankrupt? To answer those questions, I'm joined by my Hoyes and Michalos partner and co-founder, Ted Michalos. Ted, ready to go?
Let's have at it.
So let's start with the basics. When a company goes bankrupt, a licensed insolvency trustee is appointed. What's their job? What do they do?
Yeah, so the trustee's job is to try to recover as much cash as possible for the creditors. So that means they're going to seize and sell assets, try to collect receivables, all that sort of stuff.
Okay, makes sense. So the trustee, like you say, sells the inventory, the receivable, collects the receivables, sells the equipment, buildings, whatever. So now they got this pot of money. Right. Who gets it?
Well, so right now it's codified in the law. There's a list of priorities. And it's literally you start with all the money that you've got. You pay the first priority first. Second, third, you work your way down to the bottom. Employees, I think right now are somewhere around the third category.
Yeah, so the government gets their hands in there first.
Yeah, for things like GST and source deductions.
So anything that the company has held, and then, of course, the banks come up next.
Whoever had a specific lien or a charge on an asset, they get paid the money from that asset.
And then you're right, employees would come, and we're oversimplifying it here, but you can go read Section 136 of the Bankruptcy Act and see it. But employees come next for up to $2,000 of back wages.
Or 6 months, one of the other.
Or 6 months worth of wages, whichever is the smaller of the two numbers. So, okay, now let's talk specifically about pensions. And there were two big real-life examples that I think everyone has heard of.
Sure.
Nortel was the biggest corporate bankruptcy, I think, in Canadian history. It happened back in 2009. There were 20,000 pensioners in their plan, and at the time it was projected that they would only be getting somewhere between 55 cents and 70 cents on the dollar of their pension.
Right.
So if they thought they were going to get $2,000 a month when they were retired, well, they may only end up with $1,100 a month. Clearly, that's a problem.
Well, sure. I mean, all these people in good faith planned their retirement, and suddenly half of it disappeared.
Well, and what's worse is when I'm working, instead of getting paid, $10 an hour, I get paid $9.50, and the other 50 cents is getting put into my pension to tuck it away, and now it's not there. You're kind of doubly burned by that. Sears Canada was the other one. It had around 18,000 retirees. They began their liquidation sales in 2017, and at the time, there was a deficit in the pension of over $100 million. I think it was like $130 million or something. So what does it mean when there is a deficit in a pension plan?
So that means there's a shortfall in the amount of money in the pension plan available to pay out the pensions.
And so how is this even possible? Because the employer's supposed to be tucking money into it every paycheck. How can you be $100 million short?
Historically, there used to be two types of pensions. There were defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans. So the defined benefit said, I'm promising you X percentage of your income when you retire. And almost all government pensions are defined benefits.
Yes, of course.
So it doesn't matter how much money is put into the pot, they're promising to pay you a certain amount. And so when the investments that the pension fund makes don't realize enough income, then there ends up being a deficit. That's the most common way that happens. What also used to happen is companies used to raid the surpluses in their pension plans when they were good years. And then, of course, when the market and the investment switch, they end up short.
Which is a big problem as well.
A huge problem, yep.
Okay, so let's talk then about the question we're trying to answer today, which is, should the law put pensioners at the top of the list? Because you already said that they're pensioners are essentially at the bottom of the list with everybody else.
Right.
Employees are near the top, but only for a small slice of whatever wages they're owed. So if a company goes bankrupt and there's a shortfall in the pension, when the trustee liquidates all of the assets, should that money first go to make up the pension shortfall?
Right.
So that retirees, which of course didn't cause this problem and have worked their entire life on the understanding that they'd be able to retire with a set pension, don't get screwed. So should they be number one on the list?
Well, so there's already some protection in place. So, I mean, we're talking here in Ontario, although you could be listening to us anywhere in the world, I guess.
Yes, the technology today.
We've got, Ontario's got the Pension Benefits Act, which basically says that money that an employee puts into a pension fund is a deemed trust. So it's protected by law because it's the employee's money that somebody else is looking after.
So it's at the top of the list.
Right. We've also got the Personal Property Security Act in Ontario that basically says that deemed trusts are only subordinated to secured creditors. So they rank in priority above regular creditors.
Yeah, and that's a technical area of the law. It deals with receivables, inventory, things like that. We won't get into that in any kind of detail.
Well, and frankly, I don't think that provides any protection because the secured creditors are going to take all the money anyway. So.
Yeah. So you're saying then that we have laws that protect to a certain extent what the employee has put in.
Correct.
But there's no protection for what the employer has put in.
Not that we're aware of.
Over that time period.
Yep.
Okay, so why then don't we just pass a law that says whatever funds are available when a company goes bankrupt, it goes first to the retirees if there is a pension shortfall? Because again, we've already said it. They're the most deserving people. The way it works now, if all the store fixtures are sold or the real estate is sold, that money will first go to the government, and whatever's left over goes to the banks. And do the banks deserve more money than the retirees?
Well, I mean, that's a political question. We could have some fun with that, and maybe we should. But the real question is you got to take this a step further. So what you're talking about doing from a common sense perspective sounds reasonable, but there are always unintended consequences. So if suddenly you say the pension fund has to be fully funded first, then all of the banks are going to look at the pension funds before they lend or extend credit.
So explain how a bank lends then. So I'm a company and I've got, I don't know, $10 million worth of inventory.
Right. So in most cases, a bank will say, well, we'll lend you money against that $10 million to a certain percentage. I think a typical example is 3/4, so 75 or 80%. And so what they're saying is, as long as you've got $10 million worth of inventory, we're willing to lend you $8 million against that inventory. So every month we're going to check, is there $10 million worth of inventory? Okay, the $8 million line of credit is good. If your inventory drops, the amount of money we're willing to lend you or extend you on that line of credit drops. And so if we suddenly now say that the pension has to be fully funded, and I don't know, the company, well, the example was it's $100 million short, then the bank is going to say, well, that $100 million needs to be topped up before we're going to lend you any money against any of your assets. And so suddenly the company doesn't have enough money to actually operate anymore.
So the bank, instead of lending you $8 million, will lend you zero.
Correct. In fact, they're going to want you to
kick in money before they even talk to you.
Yep.
And I remember back, 20, 30 years ago when I was doing corporate work before we started Hoyes and Michalos, one of my jobs was to go out and do that calculation.
Right.
So I'd go out and I'd say, okay, what are the receivables worth? What's the inventory worth? Count it all up. And then what is out there that would come before the bank? So have you paid your GST? Have you paid your employees' wages and source deductions and all that? And all those get knocked off what the bank is willing to lend. Well, if there's a big shortfall in the pension, that gets knocked off too. All of a sudden, banks aren't willing to lend anything. So that's one of the unintended consequences of putting this first. And I guess the other obvious one is if you make the rules too complicated, then as an employer, I might not even offer a pension. And in fact, it's somewhat unusual now to even see pensions. I think
most companies now are doing RSP matching funds, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to administer.
80% of pensions are probably government, because they work for the government and it's not an issue. Whereas, certainly less than 30% of the private sector probably has pensions. So, a new law isn't going to work. Now, there's more to this story here.
Right.
And let's talk about Sears, because this was the most recent one in the story, and everyone's heard this name. So I actually did some research here.
Okay.
In 2002, Kmart in the U.S. filed for bankruptcy protection and a hedge fund. And what is a hedge fund?
So a hedge fund, or the other name people give to hedge funds are vulture funds.
Vulture funds.
Right.
So they invest money in companies in the hopes that they'll make lots of money back.
They're looking for quick returns and significant returns. They're trying to cover their bets.
Yeah, Warren Buffett isn't running a hedge fund. He's got a much longer.
He's a value investor. He buys it under what he thinks are undervalued with their future potential.
Holds it for many years. Hedge funds a little quicker.
Right.
So this hedge fund in the U.S. bought their Kmart's asset out of the bankruptcy, became the majority shareholder, and in 2005, that hedge fund took control of Sears Canada.
Right.
And we all know where Kmart is today, right?
Right. And Sears.
And Sears. Business wasn't good. Stores were losing money, but that didn't stop the big American hedge fund from stripping cash out of Sears by declaring dividends to themselves.
Right.
So dividends are just, here's money for me, the owner. 2005, they took out $1.5 billion. 2010, $750 million. 2012, $100 million. 2013, $500 million. Now, by 2007, it was obvious that there was a deficit in the pension plan because it gets published every year.
Right.
And it kept getting worse. In 2007, the deficit was $36 million. By 2010, it was over $300 million. Even by 2015, it was still $267 million. So the point is, there was a deficit. But instead of putting the money into the pension plan, the owners, the hedge fund, put it in their own pockets. So if I was going to pass a law, I wouldn't pass a law that says pension shortfalls come first because you already described what the problems would be. But I would pass a law that says the owners cannot take out dividends if the pension is in a shortfall position. What do you think of that?
Well, so that makes sense. And in fact, Bill, what is it?
S253. So this is a bill in the Senate.
By Art Eglinton, right?
Art Eglinton, of course, is now retired.
Yep.
Anyway.
There were two features to this law. A super priority for unfunded pensions under the BIA or the CCAA, Company Creditors Arrangements Act. And two was the restrictions on dividends or buybacks, which basically says that's the point that you're
what
making.
I just said. Yeah. Yep. So the first point, well, okay, you and I are a little, we're not convinced that's going to work.
Right.
Because it'll impair potential financing. But I think the restrictions on dividends, well, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? If there's no money there, then you shouldn't be able to take it out.
I think the legal complication will be that most large pension funds are separate corporate legal entities than the corporations themselves. So I think that'd be interesting.
Yeah. So, which is why we're discussing it.
Right.
We're throwing these ideas out to see what will happen. So that's pensions we're talking about, which again only exists for probably less than 30% of employees in the private sector, and the number keeps falling.
Yeah, the oldest and biggest corporations.
Yeah, not the new startups, not the new tech.
I'm guessing
startup.
Amazon doesn't do a
No,
pension.
I'm pretty sure they probably don't even do benefits. So what is more common, and you alluded to this, is group RSPs or company RSPs, where the employer gives you money to put in an RSP, and employers prefer those because why?
They're really simple to administer.
Simple.
So it's a typical example is if you put in 5% of your pay, the employer will match a 5% contribution. So from the employee's perspective, that's fabulous. You're guaranteed 100% return on your initial contribution. With government limits and the like, I don't know how many people are actually putting as the maximum amount that they could into these things. That's the only downside.
And is it possible for there to be a RRSP shortfall?
No, it's impossible because you are making contributions, and then either, depending on the plan that you have, you're administering it yourself or somebody's administering a fund for you, and you get the return. So an RSP is a defined contribution type pension plan. The problem everybody got into with shortfalls with pensions is the defined benefit plans. And so basically they're just saying, we don't need these anymore.
Yeah, if we promise that you're going to get $2,000 a month in your pension, then we got to make sure there's enough money to fund that.
For however long you live.
Yeah, and that's a mathematical difficult thing to figure out because you got to do actuarial tables and all the rest of it.
And when all of these things were agreed to in government contracts, people were living to 80 years old. Now they're living to 85 years old. Well, that extra 5 years of income has to come from somewhere.
Well, when CPP first came in, people were living to 67.
Right.
So, okay, you retire at 65. We've only got to fund 2 years. It's not a big deal. Obviously, a much bigger deal now.
Right.
So, if my employer has an RRSP matching program and then my employer goes bankrupt, it has no impact on the plan.
Right, because the RSPs are in your name someplace. You're administering them or paying somebody to administer them. The company's got nothing to do with it.
So, do we need a law to protect employees if they are in a group RRSP plan?
Well, and effectively, we already do. RSP contributions, with the exception of the 12 months immediate preceding your own personal bankruptcy, are protected. So the government's made the decision that pension funds are for tomorrow. We're saving for your future. So they've now protected them short of the last year's contributions.
So if my employer is putting, let's say, $500 a month into my RSP for me,
that's a good deal.
And they go bankrupt on, I don't know, July the 1st, and they haven't put the money in from April, May, and June, then I guess I lose that money.
You might be able to argue that qualifies under the $2,000 priority claim for wages.
So there already is protection
There's
then.
something there, yep.
And so it would be somewhat unlikely if they've gone 2 years without making those contributions, because you as an employee are, to a certain extent, in control of your RSP.
Yep.
You get a statement from the RSP company. You know what's going in.
And certainly you monitor what's going in there. It's what you're contributing and you're expecting your employer to match. If suddenly they stop making the match, I think you'd ask questions.
Yeah, and it's a little more difficult when it's some complicated pension plan.
Right.
Now, another way employees get compensated is through stock option plans and share buyback plans and things like that. So what is a stock option plan? How does that work?
Employees or whomever has been granted one of these, sometimes they go to directors as well, are given a right to purchase shares in the company at a specific price.
And there's really no need to protect that, because if the company goes bankrupt, then the shares are worth
worthless.
anything anyways, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so let's get to practical advice now, because that's really what we're here for, not to discuss Section 136 of the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act.
Right.
What can you, as an employee, do to protect yourself if your employer goes bankrupt? So let's start with the pension thing and work our way down.
Well, so if you're one of those people, a government employee or somebody in a large corporation that still has a company pension plan, keep an eye on it. So, I mean, it's very easy to say, I've got a pension and not pay any attention to it. Check with the Financial Services Commission of Ontario website to see if there are any issues listed there. And if your plan has a shortfall, start making contingency plans of your own.
Yeah, because a shortfall doesn't just happen one day.
Right.
As we saw with Sears, it was going back a decade where they had these problems. So as an employee, I should have been aware. Now, I mean, shoulda, woulda, coulda. It's past history, and I'm certainly not going to be blaming the employees for the problems at Sears.
Yep.
And even if I was aware of it, well, I still need a job. I'm still going to keep working there.
But if you're aware, then you can take action. So again, watch to see what's happening in the company. Have they have a hiring freeze? Or is there a wage freeze? Are they laying people off? You can usually get a feel if there are financial difficulties in your company.
Yeah, if you're working for a company that makes horseshoes, that may not have a lot of growth prospects in the future, right?
Are they electric?
That's right. If they're electric, then you're all
fine.
set. So yeah, be aware of what's going on. If you're in a company that seems to be in trouble, and there's also a shortfall with the pension, then that would be the time to perhaps be looking for another job, I guess. If nothing else.
And of course, if your employer does offer matching funds with RSPs, it's an automatic return on your money. I mean, the example I gave was, you contribute a certain amount and the company matches it, that's 100% return. You're never going to do that in any kind of fund you buy. So you should do that to the maximum.
Yep, it's kind of a no-brainer. So take advantage of what's out there. And then what else can you do to protect yourself then?
Well, so the biggest thing that we see these days is there's so many people going into retirement with debt. 20 years ago, you wouldn't take any debt into retirement, or if you had it, it would be small. Your house is paid for, very little unsecured debt, credit cards and lines of credit. And now we're seeing people with significant debt. I mean, the most important one being that they're carrying large mortgages because they've refinanced their house. But it's not sustainable. Your pension is going to be lower than your employment income. There's going to be less money coming in, so you've got to have fewer things to pay for.
Yeah, It's a good point. I mean, your pension is probably, 50%, 60%, 70% of what you were making.
Even if it's 80%, it's
still less. Yeah, even if it's 95%, it's still less.
Yep.
And so maybe some of your expenses go down a little bit when you're retired, because I'm not driving to work every day. Maybe I don't have to buy a new suit every year.
Maybe.
But you also have more time, so you're probably doing other things that
and people are living longer and you're in better health. So if you're retiring at 65 where you're thinking, I'm going to go sit on the porch, there aren't many people doing that anymore.
Well, we all live in condos that have no porches, but yes, you're absolutely right. So your advice then is you got to have a bit of a forward thinking, looking forward.
It's like any other aspect of your financial plan. You've got to be aware. Nobody else is as interested in your future as you. So you've got to take responsibility. If you've got a pension, make sure the pension is stable, that it's fully funded. If there are problems with your employer, you're seeing warning signs, then develop a plan B. What are you going to do to protect yourself? Because nobody else is going to protect you.
Yeah, having a fresh resume, seeing what's out there. And I know I don't really want to quit my employer because I've been there for 20 years and I won't get as good a job. Well, but working for Sears for 20 years meant that you're now not working for Sears anymore.
Right.
And
if you stayed to Nortel to the end, you got 50 cents on the dollar for your pension.
Yeah.
Whereas if you took a package early,
Yeah, maybe. And
Yep.
again, we realize we're
hindsight.
it's all hindsight.
Yeah.
So I can't tell you what to do at any point in time. All we're really saying is actually consider the options. If my employer was to go out of business tomorrow, how would that impact me?
Yep.
And the answer is, well, obviously it would severely impact me. So I want to have some savings in addition to my company pension. I want to have my own savings, and I want to have my resume, ready just in case I need to move. Excellent. I think that's a good way to end it. Ted, thanks very much.
Okay.
So here's my take on all this. I think it is evil for an employer to promise a pension and then not provide it. Maybe that's too strong a word, but hey, that's what I think. A pension is an employer saying, instead of paying you $1, I'll pay you 95 cents, but I'll put the extra 5 cents away for your retirement. If you have a company pension, it means that the company paid you less today because they were setting aside money for your retirement. If that money isn't there, they aren't keeping up their end of the bargain, and that's evil. It hurts a very vulnerable group in society, the elderly, the retired, who are no longer working. But passing new laws to give retirees a priority in bankruptcy may have, as we discussed, two big unintended consequences. Banks and investor lending might be less, which may cause companies to go out of business sooner, which doesn't really help anybody. And of course, there will be even fewer company pension plans, which has certainly been the trend over the last 20 years because it's not worth it for the company. Now, I am in favor of passing a law that makes company directors personally liable if they declare a dividend to shareholders when the company pension plan is in a deficit. That's only fair, and it's pretty easy to implement. There are already directors' obligations for other things. But we're not here to advise the government or big corporations. We give advice to real people, and I agree with what Ted just said. Know the warning signs. If your employer's in trouble, start looking for another job, and don't rely too heavily on your company pension plan. Get out of debt, because having debt makes you, you're not free. Getting rid of debt makes you free, reduces your risk. And third, once you're out of debt, save money. Use RSPs or however else you want to save, because if you have your own money, you don't have to worry about the future. That's our show for today. A full transcript and full show notes are available at hoyes.com with links to all the different legislation we talked about and the website where you can go to check out your company pension. Thanks for listening and watching. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.